The war in Darfur is a genocidal campaign against non-Arab citizens in Sudan by the existing Arab population in the country. The conflict has evolved from a local genocide to an international issue with involvement of both China and the United States. China and the US fund the two opposing parties, the Arabs and Africans, and these two groups purchase weapons and other armaments to fuel the fighting. This conflict has continued since 2003 and still exists today. The Arabic Janjaweed rebels, supported by the Sudanese government, massacred about 300,000 civilians and displaced about 3 million. This attempted Arab apartheid instituted by the Sudanese government has brought about international concern, forcing the ICC to charge the Sudanese president for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So, why should we care? The Sudanese conflict is something of importance because of the horrors that come with it. This conflict has ruined and displaced whole regions and caused the terrorized Sudanese Africans to become refugees in their own homes. Along with that, there have been many atrocities committed by both sides of the conflict, such as rape, cannibalism, and enslavement. There also have been many recorded instances of child soldiers fighting in these conflicts, which should bring about some sentiment. These atrocities are ongoing, aided by the funding from China, whose main interest in the area is oil. Because of China's funding, the Sudanese government grants them oil contracts. This greed for oil will continue to fund the Sudanese conflict. According to Taipei News, 80% of Sudan's oil exports go to China, currently worth more than $2 billion a year. Beijing is also investing millions in infrastructure, including the pipeline from the oil fields to the tanker terminal in Port Sudan. Chinese laborers are building roads and airfields in oil-producing regions. Some of these airfields are used by the Sudanese Air Force to launch air attacks on undefended villages in Darfur.
View regarding this situation is that what they want to do to benefit the best. They see an opportunity to get oil in this country, in Sudan, at the expense of the people. Recently, we've had lots of Chinese oil workers and engineers in Chinese oil companies working in Sudan in places that might be areas of conflict, in part with the Sudanese government. This is all at the expense of people who are opposing the government, and to earn rights to the oil, Sudan has a history of supplying them with arms, positions in the UN, and votes in the UN to benefit them and reduce sanctions. And then another Chinese point of view would be the relationships between the Chinese president and Omar al-Bashir, the president of Sudan, who is currently wanted for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. While China would benefit internationally the best, probably from breaking relations with them and abiding by international law, they have commonly broken the sanctions of for armed weapons in exchange for oil contracts. The geopolitical situation of the Chinese point of view is what can China get the best out of it and the region? China's the largest foreign investor in Sudan with $5 billion in oil fields. It owns most of the consortiums that are responsible for pumping out oil. They hold 95% of oil drilling rights in Sudan and in the regions of conflict in Darfur. China imports 2/3 of Sudan's oil from the Red Sea and South Sudan. Oil production has risen from 60,000 barrels a day to 500,000 barrels a day, mostly due to Chinese investment. Another thing China has to its benefit is its spot on the Security Council in the UN. This allows it to downvote UN resolutions and put off sanctions against Sudan and its government. They use it as a means to protect them, to protect their oil interests. Sudanese point of view of the conflict in Darfur is more about living their lives and being able to live without fearing for the removal from their land, while the Chinese obviously have interests in the natural resources of the country. National Geographic provides a feature on the conflict in Darfur and what's happening between the rebels, government, and the population.
Sudan, the largest country in Africa, lies where the Sahara Desert meets the grasslands of the Sahel. Since its independence in 1956, civil wars between Sudan's north and south have killed millions and displaced millions more. Now a new conflict has emerged in its westernmost region, called Darfur. Nearly the size of France, this vast region has been neglected for years by the government. Darfur means Land of the Four, a Muslim African tribe indigenous to the area. The region is inhabited by many tribes that are racially and culturally intertwined. But despite these cultural similarities, groups of farmers who are viewed as African and groups of herders who are considered Arab have had clashes over the land for decades. Droughts, famines, desertification, and population pressures have added to the rising tensions. Since 2003, rebel groups have fought against the government, accusing it of supporting the Arab herders over the African farmers. The government's response caused a mass exodus, forcing villagers to become refugees in their own homeland. In this United Nations refugee camp along the Chad-Sudan border, the women and children here seek asylum from the Janjaweed, the armed militias of Arab herders organized by the government to fight the rebels and kill civilians. Entire villages have been burned, hundreds of thousands have died. Beatings, rapes, and mutilations are used as weapons of terror. Around 2 million people, almost a third of Darfur's population, have fled their villages.
Sudanese government, 90% of that being after 2004, in which the UN enacted a arms embargo. Many of Chinese-made weapons have ended up in the hands of Janjaweed rebels, which are used to kill civilians and used in conflict against the African population. According to another UN report, China also sold $20 million in arms and ammunition to South Sudan, fueling the conflict between the Sudanese government and the South Sudanese government. According to a UN official, China can exercise absolute control over its own actions and can stop shipping arms to the Sudanese government, which has publicly stated that it will ignore the UN arms embargo. In addition to the sales of small arms and weapons, China has sold 17 Hongdu JL-8 jets to the Sudanese Air Force and have trained their pilots, which have participated in air raids in Darfur and against South Sudan. According to a report by a human rights group, the terms of the embargo cover not only just the supply of weapons, military vehicles, paramilitary equipment, it also covers training and technical assistance, so the training of pilots obviously falls within the scope of the embargo.